Hey guys, you're listening to Metal Matters, a weekly gimme radio podcast. I'm your host, Mike Hill. If you like metal, punk, hardcore, or anything extreme, you've come to the right place. So subscribe and never miss out. This episode is a companion piece to episode 12 from a while back, where we covered Hallowed Ground by the band Skinyard on one of the classic records episodes that Randy and I do. I was able to sit down with Daniel House, founding member, bassist, CEO of CZ Records, and a guy that also worked at Sub Pop for a period of time. And we talk about the formation of the band, we talk about CZ Records, and we talk about the formation of that legendary Northwest heavy rock scene from the late 80s and early 90s. A while back, we did a classic records Skinyard Hallowed Ground episode, and that's how you and I got in touch, and that was really cool that you heard that.
I don't even remember how. I think I just, I think I have notifications that come in by email, every Google notifications, and suddenly this thing popped in. I'm like, what the hell's this? Listen to it, and I'm like, this is really cool.
Yeah. So Skinyard, CZ Records. Sure, go ahead.
Can I say that was really fucking cool, or do I have to say this is cool?
Oh no, man, we're street level here, man. This is for the people, and we can curse and say all sort blasphemy, all that stuff's on the table. So
I'm all in for blasphemy.
Right on, me too. So Skinyard, CZ Records, and Sub Pop. There's a lot to talk about, and I got to be honest, man. I don't even know where to start. So I'm gonna start with Skinyard, which seems to be the beginning of the story, I guess.
To a large degree, I would say that's true. Yeah. Actually, Skinyard was before Sub Pop, and it was before CZ. So yeah.
Yeah, and that band, for those of you out there who missed the classic records episode where Randy and I covered Hallowed Ground, please go back and listen to that, because it's a possibility that you might not be familiar with that particular record or this particular band. But I will go as far as to say that Skinyard was one of the bands that, if you were to map out a family tree of that late 80s, early 90s Northwest music scene that gave us Soundgarden, the Melvins, Nirvana, all those bands, that they play a very big part in the formation of that sound and that whole like vibe that was going on in that part of the country.
The bands you just mentioned were basically, most of the earliest bands from that scene. It was Skinyard and Malfunction and Green River, Melvins, a couple more. You Men were actually the band that was sort of established and around at that time, but they didn't quite fit with sort of what was beginning to bubble up from within the scene. But they were certainly the elder statesmen of the harder Seattle underground.
Yeah, just to give you a little background on myself, I lived in Bellingham, Washington for about a year in the early 90s. I would say it was around 1992. And during that period of time, everyone I ran into that was into music or playing, a certain type of music that I was interested in, at least, was talking about Skinyard. And they were like, me being from the East Coast and not really being that familiar with any of that stuff, because 91, 92, bands like the Melvins, Green River, Mother Love Bone, all those bands we were talking about were still really below the sort of radar of a lot of people on the East Coast. And everyone's like, oh yeah, you play guitar, you like heavy rock, check out Skinyard. And one of the things that I really dug about the band was, yeah, definitely there was like this heavy rock thing. There was like you can tell you guys were into punk, and especially on Hallowed Ground, I feel like there was like this real dark, very, very dark vibe.
Skinyard was a band who had a lot of influences sort of from the different, individual members of the band. And I think to some degree we sort of wore those influences on our sleeve a little bit anyway. And I felt like most of the other bands that were around at the time were very specifically this thing or that thing. And we were this band that sort of brought in a lot of different things. So I always felt like we kind of stood a little bit apart from just sort of that scene in general. We shared a lot of the same aesthetics in terms of, kind of dark, heavy, we were very groove oriented, but very thick, one of the things about that whole scene was, it was all about heavy guitar rock, and it was very much a response against kind of the real slick, Hollywood Boulevard kind of scene that had largely dominated kind of the rock airwaves in the late 80s, bands like, Poison and all of those bands. And this was kind of a lashback against that kind of slickness, and more towards just something that was more, I suppose, raw and probably a little more just kind of primal, I suppose.
Now, the band started in the 80s. I think you guys formed. Yeah. Well, I should ask you, actually, instead of me telling you when the band formed.
Well, the band started in effectively 1985. Our very, very first show actually was 1985 in June. We opened for the U-Men Leave Home show, which back then was a big deal because we didn't have any bands that were actually going on tour. This was like, and from all accounts, it was kind of a disastrous tour from them, but it was still a big deal. Like, oh my God, the U-Men are leaving home. They're going on tour. Holy shit. And, we were able to secure a position on that bill. That was our very first bill. And, that was kind of like, oh man, that's kind of a big to do. We were unknown at that point, but Matt Cameron at that point was our drummer. This was before he was in Skinyard, before he was in Soundgarden, before he was in Pearl Jam. He was our first drummer for about the first year.
And also Jack Endino, the famous record producer, was in the band too.
Yes, he was. But at that point in '85, he was largely unknown. He wasn't. He had started recording a lot of these bands, but just started. That happened very organically. But yeah, Jack did end up recording, the first Soundgarden, the first, well, actually it wasn't the first one, but the first Soundgarden, and the first Nirvana record was done by Jack. I mean, I think to date he probably has literally over 600 records to his resume. And it goes, it's endless. I mean, he's one of the best Quest for Fire records he did. He's worked for this band that few people have ever heard. It's probably the biggest hard rock band in Brazil. They're called Titas. They can literally sell out 50,000 seat arenas, but specifically in Brazil, because they actually speak in Portuguese, which I think is kind of fascinating.
Okay. Yeah. So the original lineup of the band was you, Jack Endino, Ben McMillan, and Matt Cameron, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Ben, of course, later went on to form Grunt Truck.
Yeah.
Though, to be fair, Grunt Truck actually overlapped with Skinyard. It started while Skinyard was still active, and then once Skinyard finally broke up, Ben just continued with Grunt Truck.
And that featured some guys that played in The Accused, I believe, too. Right?
Well, it featured specifically Tommy from The Accused. And then the drummer of that band was Scott, who was our second drummer, who was also the drummer that was on the record that you mentioned, Hallowed Ground. So Scott was on our second and our third record, Hallowed Ground being our second, and Fist Sized Chunks being our third record. And then it was actually during that tour, we did a tour before we recorded Fist Size Chunks after Hallowed Ground. It was during that tour that the earliest seeds of Grunt Truck started to happen between Ben and Scott.
Like when I first heard actually all of those bands from that time period, like when I, a young man, I just rolled up to Bellingham, Washington. I was discovering all these bands, and Skinyard was like probably my favorite band out of all the bands that I discovered around that time. I'm in my early 20s. I grew up listening to Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. When I was like in my early teens, I discovered the Ramones, Black Flag, Flipper, bands like that. And when I heard Skinyard, it was almost like the perfect sort of crossing of all of those bands into this sound, which, as you mentioned earlier, was still a reaction to the slickness of maybe what was going on with, like, bands like Poison, like you mentioned, Motley Crue and this kind of thing.
Right.
Yet there was still like a very definitive nod to guitar-based rock, like heavy rock. So
absolutely.
Were you guys, it's the thing is, what came first, punk or hard rock with you guys? Or were you into punk at all?
I think I don't think that's a binary question, because I think as I mentioned earlier, the individual members of the band really brought in a lot of their own influences. So, for instance, when Scott was a drummer in the band, he was probably into a lot more hardcore and a lot more punk, and so some of that came through on those couple of records with him. But Jack was into certain. When I say Jack, I mean Mike Giacodino. Some people call him Mike, some people call him Jack. But Jack and Dino, he was a little bit older, and he probably came in with a larger pot of classic 70s hard rock, and I probably came in with more of I probably had more of a punk influence, but also a lot more of the sort of goth influence. A lot of the bands in the 80s that really influenced me, for instance, were bands like Killing Joke, and as you mentioned, Bauhaus, and even Susie and the Banshees, and a lot of these kind of darker, hypnotic, kind of heavy bands. And Jack was probably brought in more classic stuff that was maybe more blues based, things like Rory Gallagher and Groundhogs, if your fans are familiar with Tony Fee and the Mighty Groundhogs. But everybody kind of brought in different stuff, And then the other thing that's also relevant is in those early to mid 80s years in Seattle, it was a pretty small scene, and everybody in all the bands basically knew each other, and everybody in all the bands basically supported each other and went to each other's shows. And, it was an incredibly fertile time. There was a lot of people, a lot of bands creating a lot of really cool, exciting stuff, most of it heavy, not all. But I have to believe that we also, to some certain degree, kind of cross-pollinated and influenced each other as well, if that makes sense.
No, so, totally makes sense. Totally. Yeah.
I mean, if I'm looking at just as an example, I think I mentioned to you that I'm working on the Skinyard book, and I've fairly recently completed a pretty much complete gig list from 85 through 91. And just as a, for instance, I'm looking at a bill from October of 85, Green River, Room 9, who you may not know, Soundgarden, Skinyard. We played with the U-Men New Year's Eve of that same year. Later the next year, we're playing shows with Green River, Bundle of Hiss, My Eye. Again, we played a lot of shows with Soundgarden over the early years. Because, back then Soundgarden was playing at the same small clubs that we were.
Yeah.
And then I think in like 87, we played with Faith No More, and I think in 88 we played with like Flaming Lips. And so, at these times when these bands were certainly in the midst of their ascent, but still club bands, not yet arena rock bands, which, for some people might be kind of like, what? Wait, what? I mean, it's kind of a fun thing to brag about a little bit. Not that I try to be a braggart, but Nirvana opened for Skinyard on 4 different occasions. One of my favorite posters is this old poster from 1988, which says Skinyard, Coffin Break, and Nirvana. And actually, that was in Bellingham. So, Nirvana opened for us in Coffin Break in November of '88. People are like, no, they didn't. I'm like, yeah, they did, because Nirvana started as this, tiny little small band, and nobody knew that they were going to become, the absolute force of nature that they became. It just kind of gives you some perspective on kind of what the scene looked like in those early and mid '80s. Completely different, right?
What is this book like? What's the form of this book that you're working on right now?
Well, the book is it's basically a Skinyard oral history. But I don't know if you've read any of the other sort of grunge Seattle oral history books. To me, those seem a little disjointed, and just like lots and lots and lots of sound bites all kind of squeezed together. And I'm really trying to sort of get into more of the intimate details and more of the intimate history about Skinyard. And maybe it's easier than doing that than it would be for trying to talk about an entire scene. The other thing is those books are written by people that actually didn't live there.
Right.
And I'm speaking from having been on the side and, having known all these people. So, there's, Bruce Pavitt and John Huntman from Sub Pop are, have been interviewed, and, of course, everybody in the band, and, different members, different drummers. So, we had effectively 4 drummers over the course of being a band. The first of which was Matt Cameron, and the last of which was Barrett Martin. So they're all in the book. Steve Turner from Mudhoney and Dan Peters from Mudhoney. I'm going to try to get Mark Arm on there, especially because I knew he was not a fan of the band, and I actually want that dichotomy, because I'm not looking for just like cheerleaders. I want to actually sort of tell the messy and sometimes not that complimentary story of this band. I just interviewed with Kate Yamamoto the other day. I'm supposed to be interviewing with Garrett Shablik of The Fluid shortly. So when all's said and done, it'll probably be 30 to 40 different interviews, and it'll be woven together as a oral history, but also with a lot of my own narrative kind of woven throughout to kind of set the stage. And then in places I might interject with the book itself. I also have a poster gallery in there, and if I can do everything as I'd like to actually have either a CD in there or like a digital download sort of a selection for people who may not know the band. The band hasn't been a band for literally 3 decades or almost 3 decades. The last show that Skinyard ever played in Seattle was in July of 1991. The last show they ever played in the U.S. was in October of '91, and the last show they ever played was in November of '91, and that was on tour in Europe. But the final record came out either '91 or '92, so it was released posthumously. So for all intents and purposes, as a live band, the band was actually together as a unit through '91, and that was pretty much it. So it was a damn good run, for sure.
No, definitely. And it's funny because to me, Skinyard is a household name. You know what I mean? It's like when I tour with my band, I play music when I'm driving, and it's like,
sure.
People are like, "Oh, who is this?" And I'm like, "What do you mean, who is this? It's Skinyard." Like, why the fuck don't you know who this is? You know what I mean? And then, but everyone that in my band loves you guys. It's like,
that's great.
Yeah, we're into it, and everyone that since over the last like 20 something years or whatever, 30 years that I played their, the music for loves the records. And I'm really happy to hear that there's like this book coming out. However, it seems like a daunting task to put together something like that.
I've been working on it for 2 years so far.
Yeah. Okay. So I thought something like that. Yeah.
Probably going to be at least another year before I have something ready to actually show to people.
I mean, I'm a big fan of oral histories, and I feel like that particularly trying to weave together all these different accounts seems to be incredibly hard. Like and hard to pull off too.
Yeah, I think so far that's accurate.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to be. I really think it's going to be a great book. I think it's going to be a really interesting read, and um, you know, and I also think it's going to be something that I don't know. There's so many books on so many big, globally known bands, but I very often find books on smaller bands to be more interesting because there's something that actually more people can get into, especially people who have been in bands or want to be in bands, because the vast majority of bands end up being rather small in terms of their historical relevance, right?
Absolutely.
So it's something. So it's sort of more relatable in that regard. When you're talking about bands that have reached the level of rock stardom, that seems, when these people are suddenly, they're not people anymore. They're icons. And so we view our icons in our society in such a different way than we do sort of, our heroes that, maybe got to open for somebody once in an arena, but ultimately, were mostly a club band or maybe like they got to play like a 2,000 seater. I used to say in the day that I always thought that the best level of success would have been to be like a band like King Crimson, because they can consistently play to 2,000 to 3,000 people. They all make a living. They've been making a living for decades. And yet you can still largely go out on the street and remain semi-anonymous. But you've got a good living.
Yeah.
And you're more connected actually with your fan base. I remember I saw Soundgarden so many times in clubs, and everybody knew everybody, and everybody in the club was probably friends with those guys. And then I remember the first time I actually went and saw them at an arena, and it was just weird. It didn't feel right to me, because I'm like, this isn't who are these people? These aren't their fans. They don't know. It's that whole like, well, they were my band first. But it's a different experience because you don't have that intimacy that you get to have with in a smaller venue.
Yeah,
and,
definitely.
I still think that's the best way to see music is, like 2,000 is getting kind of big, but I can deal with that, But I still to this day love seeing bands, in venues that are under 1,000 people, maybe other, 500 people. It's great.
It's funny. It's only been like maybe within the last, I would say, between 5 and 10 years that I've actually enjoyed going to see these big, rock shows. I think when Sabbath had some of their reunions, and then the Slayer farewell tour, like things like that, that is when I started really enjoying going to like large arena type shows. But I'm with you on the size of the venue. I like, I would prefer to see a band in a 500 cap room, or, maybe 1,000, 1,500, cap room or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I never saw Nirvana again after they hit it big. I was just like, I don't need to. I know who they are. I know what they're about. I love them as a band. I mean, but I don't want to have that experience kind of taint my memories of having seen them, 24 times in small clubs.
Yeah.
Where you can go hang out with Kurt afterwards and, just shoot the shit and drink a beer.
Now, around the time of Skinyard's existence, you became involved with CZ Records.
Yes.
And that label had existed prior to Skinyard.
Correct.
Okay. So,
yeah.
So how'd that come about?
So originally, Chris Hanzek and his then girlfriend, Cassell, had started this little label called CZ Records. And I don't ultimately know everything that inspired them to want to do this, but Chris had identified this small handful of bands in the scene that were kind of doing something that was different. And I have to be honest, I don't recall how we ended up having the good fortune of being on that comp. But it's called Deep Six because there are 6 bands on the compilation, right? There's Human, Green River, Malfunction, Melvins, Soundgarden, and Skinyard.
Well, hold on a second. Before you just gloss over the Deep Six comp, that's actually like a legendary compilation that came out.
Yeah.
And it's
you're
like, oh yeah, they want to put together this comp, and I'm like, well, hold on a second. It's the Deep Six comp.
Because at the time that's what it was. They were just kind of they had no idea. Chris had never done a label. He was a local engineer who had started this little studio, and I think he kind of had this idea of putting it together, and he was going to be the primary engineer for each of the songs, and then each band on the record got to have one person in the studio with Chris for like mixing and all that. And of course, in our case, that was Jack and Dino. but there was no sense at that time that this record would be anything of any particular relevance. It was just going to be this cool record. I mean, it was released in a limited edition of, I forget if it was 1,000 or 2,000. I want to say 2,000, but I could be wrong. And even then, when it first came out, it was selling primarily only in Seattle. Like it was not easy to get distributors to pick it up. It was not easy to get distributors to give a shit enough to actually try to sell it to stores around the country. So it was this quiet little local record at first. The second record that Chris put out was the first 45 by Melvins, and it was 6 songs on a little 7-inch, and it was all recorded live to 2-track, which is kind of amazing. Yeah. And this is when Melvins were a much faster, punkier band. They weren't so thick and heavy and just punishing. They were they were an intense band, but they were fast, which is kind of sort of hard to imagine. And then after that, Chris was just like, dude, I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to be in the studio and record bands, and he had most of the records were literally in boxes under his bed. And so he was going to end the label. And I basically approached him and said, hey, dude, I have an idea. What do you think about basically giving me the label? And I will I'll buy the inventory from you and I will sell it off. But moving forward, I get to basically own the label, make the decisions, release records. And what I ultimately was wanting was the opportunity to put out a record by Skinyard. And considering this was the only place where Skinyard had ever released anything, it seemed like a very kind of logical thing that Skinyard was on this Deep Six compilation on CZ Records, and then the debut record would then come out on CZ. So that's what I did. And I spent several years actually selling through the Deep Six inventory and the Melvins inventory. And by the time I had pretty much sold through that, I had probably released quite a few records by then. I'd put out the first Skinyard record and the first Skinyard 45, but I'd put out stuff by like Coffin Break back then. I'm trying to think here. It's hard to remember.
The Gits. You put out a Gits record, right?
The Gits came later, yeah, but there was a lot of stuff, and it was just a hobby. That's the thing. It was just basically I was having fun. I wasn't necessarily doing it for profit, but over time it became more and more. I started actually breaking even at some point, and then I started making money, and I was basically signing local bands. I put out stuff by Coffin Break, by a little band called My Eye, another band called Vexed. A lot of it was pretty obscure stuff in today's history. But over time, I started putting out stuff that kind of got more natural renown. One of the records I put out was the Hard to Believe Kiss Covers compilation, which had Melvins on it, which had Nirvana on it, couple of Boston bands, a bunch of Australian bands, because it was originally licensed from Waterfront Records down in Australia. I started putting out a few bands from different parts of the country, a band called Hullabaloo out of Boston.
Yeah, I remember them. Yeah.
Dirty, noisy, grungy, kind of careening, careless, dirty rock, fun stuff. And actually, I'm still really dear friends with Sluggo, who's the main guy in that band. But I put out some records by bands in Athens, Georgia, and in Philly, or was it Pittsburgh? Can't remember now. Anyway, ended up doing this for 15 some odd years. So yeah, it started with Deep Six, which of course now is legendary. But over time, I kind of built it into this label that at its peak was probably number 2 in Seattle, only to Sub Pop. And during that whole grunge explosion, it was a pretty great time to have a Seattle label putting out local indie rock because, bottom line, people all over the country and all over the world, frankly, were buying a lot of music just based on the fact that it was from the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, that's true, actually. And one of the things I wanted to impress on people too is, I'm from the East Coast, and I only lived in Washington for like a year, and then I moved back east, and people were referring to this style of music as grunge. And what I want to put out there is that the people making this music didn't necessarily refer to it as that. That's some kind of like nomenclature that got assigned to it by maybe people who write for magazines or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Supposedly there's a lot of urban legend about how that first came to be. I think probably the most agreed upon first usage of that referring to Seattle rock was probably in some interview that Mark Arm of then Green River, but later Mudhoney, did with somebody, where I think he might have referred to it as grunge, very, very much tongue in cheek. Because if you know Mark, he's very tongue in cheek, and it kind of stuck, and that's kind of the nature of any kind of mass media or mainstream media is when something gets big, they need to sort of fit it neatly in some little box. And I've always kind of hated the word, but I accept it because when you talk grunge, people know what you're talking about, but I always talk about like, okay, well, what does Mudhoney, Alice in Chains, Tad, and Nirvana have to do with each other? Because stylistically, they're all incredibly different bands.
Yeah, definitely.
Like they're completely different. Nirvana is largely kind of this hard, dirty, but they're a pop band. They ultimately write hooky, heavy pop songs,
Yeah.
Mudhoney has roots kind of more in kind of a garage aesthetic. Alice in Chains is Alice in Chains. They're, I guess, a metal band, but they have such a distinctive sound. And then, Tad is just this heavy, crushing band. And they all played together because aesthetically they made sense together. But I always resented the fact that there was this word that was supposed to sort of be this blanket term for all of these bands that were ultimately very, very singular and very different in kind of what they were doing. They had this aesthetic of, heavy, hard guitar rock. And it wasn't slick. But you could also argue that it was not that different from, let's say, the Minneapolis scene, where you had Soul Asylum and the Replacements and Babes in Toyland and Husker Du. Similarly, kind of the same. Heavy guitar rock, some kind of hook element in there. Flannel as well. Guess what? Why? Because it's cold.
Yeah, exactly.
Like flannel was never really a fashion statement. It was never an intended thing. It was just, it was what people wear in cold climates, and maybe with like, long johns under your jeans because again for the same reason, because it's cold. But that's neither here nor there.
Before we go on, I want to, just for a little bit of exposition here, talk about the importance of Green River and the U-Men. And the U-Men are this mysterious band that you see the name, you'll watch like a documentary about the Northwest scene, and their name will be on a flyer, and you'll hear about other bands refer to them. And to a certain extent, Green River is the same type of band too.
To a certain extent, I think U-Men are a little more legendary, if for no other reason, because Green River will actually talk. So Green River has always been. I mean, the interesting thing to me about Green River is that from Green River sprang forth what we now know as Mudhoney and Pearl Jam, two very, very different kinds of bands, right?
Yeah.
But it was interesting because in Green River you had Stone and Jeff Ament on the one side being the Pearl Jam side, and then you had Steve Turner and Mark Arm from Mudhoney were there too, and it was this amalgamation of these kind of different aesthetic, we'll call them preferences. Often in the early days, especially when trying to describe this thing called grunge, people would say it was kind of this weird amalgam between like the Stooges and Aerosmith. This dirty Detroit rock, far more punk based, and then this kind of arena rock. And I've always thought that was actually pretty accurate from an aesthetic standpoint, that it was kind of this combination of the two. So, Green River was effectively, in my mind, really, really the first band in that whole scene that was kind of where the whole thing sort of started. And when I say sort of started, I mean where there's something different happening here. There's something different from what's been going on. Deep Six is kind of the record that chronicles the beginning of that whole scene. But in my mind, Green River was kind of the band that was kind of ground zero for that. Now, U-Men were kind of a different animal. U-Men were around a lot longer. They were kind of the elder statesmen of the Seattle Underground. I think they first started in like 80 or 81. I want to say, I could be wrong. But they were coming from kind of more of a swampy kind of Cramp sort of vibe, if you will.
Yeah.
And there was no band anything like U-Men really before or since. And anybody that was in that scene in those days, in the early 80s, the two bands they'll probably talk about are U-Men and another band called the Blackouts. But U-Men were around a hell of a lot longer, released more stuff, were a lot more just wild and cacophonous, and you never quite knew what was going to happen. With U-Men, there was always this edge of almost call it danger. John Bigley, their frontman, was, you want to talk about a force of nature, man. He was just, I can't even describe what it was like, but it was just like, whoa, what's John going to do this time? And they just always had this incredible swing and this incredible drive, and they were the U-Men were kind of the coolest kids that anybody knew in Seattle, and they maintained that kind of their entire career. Now, Jim Tillman, their primary bass player through most of their career, ended up later in Love Battery. Tom Price, the guitar player in the band, ended up doing Gashuffer, and now he has a band called the Tom Price Desert Classic. For half a minute, John Bigley and a couple of those guys went off to do this band that was on Amphetamine Reptile called the Crows.
Yeah.
But John Bigley and Tom Ryan basically they pretty much stopped really doing much of anything after U-Men. And it's interesting because I to this day, I don't understand it, but they don't, none of them seem to really actually even want to talk. I think I said Tom Ryan. That was wrong. It's Charlie Ryan. Charlie Ryan was their drummer. But Charlie doesn't like talking about the band. John Bigley doesn't like talking about the band. Tom Price doesn't really like talking about the band, and nobody's ever really known why.
Hmm.
So that puts them much more in this kind of, they seem much more mysterious as a result. But I have to give props where props are due. I think maybe now is actually 2018 that Sub Pop released this really lovingly assembled compilation of everything you men have ever done.
Oh,
And that,
wow. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Wow.
So if your fans want to check up on the U-Man, there is a 2-disc or 2-record set. Actually, I think the vinyl is even more than 2 records. I want to say it's 3. But the CD, I believe the CD's 2. Anyway, when Jack Endino, because Jack Endino, of course, was the guy who remastered it all and actually remixed a lot of it. When he was first pulling together all the masters to try to put this all together, they found a whole bunch of tapes of material that the band had no recollection of having even recorded. So what's so cool about this collection is that there's a whole bunch of stuff that nobody had ever heard before this came out, other than live. And so now pretty much everything they ever released, and then a whole bunch of extra stuff as well, is available in this one collection. That also includes the song that was on Deep Six as well.
Wow. You just kind of made my day, actually, because
Sweet.
I have a very spotty collection of their music. Like the records were hard to come by for me, at least. And
Yeah.
and like you said, they're mysterious guys. Like you don't know much about them. And
Yeah.
For all I can say sonically is like I always felt, and it makes sense based on what you told me, that their sound reminded me more of like those early Amphetamine Reptile releases, like Halo of Flies, and you mentioned the Crows, and some of the members went on to, or there's a connection between the Crows and U-Men. So yeah, there's a lot of, I feel like a lot of what they sound like, there are bands on the early AmRep catalog that had that sort of same like vibe to it,
Yeah, and actually there's more of a connection. So AmRep did release. I know they released at least one U-Man song. I think on one of the
Dope Guns and fucking records. Yeah.
But also for like half a minute, at one point in time, they needed a fill-in bass player, and Tom Hazelmeyer filled in for, I think, a few months as their bass player.
Just got to do a quick aside here for those of you guys out there who have no idea what the fuck we're talking about. Amphetamine Reptile Records. Some of the bands that you might be familiar with are Helmet, obviously, Unsane, maybe the Cows. Like those are bands that are were big, big Amphetamine Reptile names. The Melvins, that kind of stuff.
Has a lot of stuff, yeah.
But aside from all of that, they have a whole catalog of great music that came out with bands that you may or may not have heard of, and that's what we're getting into right now.
They put out a ton of stuff. I mean, they put out stuff by Jesus Lizard. I want to say they put something out by Tad.
Today is the day, actually.
Actually, I have another connection to Amphetamine Reptile myself.
Yeah. Okay.
Why is this not coming to mind? So I actually one of the bands that was on Amphetamine Reptile was Helios Creed.
Yes.
Who had come previously from this band called Chrome. But he has a whole shit ton of solo records under the name Helios Creed. And he came out with his very, very first one on Amphetamine Reptile was called The Last Laugh from 1989. I think he came out, I want to say 4 titles on AmRep. Anyway, that was the very first one. And actually, I am the bass player on that record. And in fact, wrote most of the material. And it was just a straight 3-piece with Helios, me, and early Skinyard drummer Jason Finn, who later would come to more fame playing in Love Battery, and then eventually becoming a very wealthy and well-known musician playing in presidents of the United States of America.
Wow.
But the three of us, I basically got together with Helios and we started jamming. And we actually did this whole record for AMREP in the studio. And over the course, literally, of 2 days, we wrote, rehearsed, and recorded the entire thing. And to this day, I still think it's a great record. It's a lot of fun.
That's not a lot of time to do something like that, for sure.
No, that was kind of, at that point in my life, and I think for a lot of people, there was so much creative juice flowing that we were just in this really creatively fertile time and just doing stuff and writing. And we just went in the studio. We had a couple of riffs that we had kind of played around with, but we didn't actually have songs yet. And so we just kind of went in. It was Helios and Jason and me, and Jack was at the helm recording, and we just did it. It was great.
At what point did you end up working for Sub Pop? Because I know you had a tenure with them too. You had a period of time to work for them.
I worked with them for 2.5 years, I believe. I'd have to look at the exact time. I want to say, I think it was 87 through the end of 1990. So very early on. When I first started working with Sub Pop, it was Bruce and John and me. It was just the three of us. And by the time I left, there was like 14 people on staff. And I'd been friends with Jonathan already. He was a fan of Skinyard. And he had actually booked us a number of times because he was working with the local radio station at that time, KCMU. And I was working at this print shop. I was working for this crazy Korean guy who was a screamer, and I don't deal well with screamers in the workplace. And one day, I just had enough, and it's the only time I've ever done this. But I basically just said, "Fuck this shit! I don't need to stay here." And I quit on the spot, middle of the day, and like, I'm done. See ya, bye. Got in my car and was driving home. No clue what the fuck I was going to be doing next in life. And as I'm driving home, I'm like, "Oh, there's Jonathan at the bus stop." So I pulled over and I offered him a ride home, and we're just talking. And he goes, "Yeah, we're you might know somebody. We're looking for a salesperson," because Charles Peterson had done it for a month or two, but just really wasn't Charles's forte as a salesperson. And Jonathan's like, "You have any ideas of anybody that might be good for this?" I'm like, "Yeah, matter of fact, I do." And he goes, "Oh, really? Who?" And I said, "Me." And he said, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "When can you start? How's Monday?" I'm like, "Do it. Let's do it." So I had a long weekend and started that Monday and built their whole distribution and what later became kind of the mainstay of their financial fluidity for those early years, which was the direct to retail portion of their business, where I basically established accounts with indie retailers all over the country, and we would sell direct to stores, COD. And the only way to really make that work was to, there wasn't enough stuff coming out on Sub Pop yet to warrant regular monthly orders. So I started bringing a lot of stuff from overseas and from other independent labels and created a whole sort of distribution arm so that there was always enough for stores to warrant making a direct purchase. And it actually worked out great because half the time, especially when the label really started to blow up, half the time stores would order stuff through Caroline, who was our distributor, and we'd get really shitty fills. They'd order like 20 copies of something and get 3. And so more and more they could rely on Sub Pop being a reliable source of getting Sub Pop material when it was, hot commodity. So yeah, I was there for, I'd say 2.5 years. Actually came back from Skinyard tour, and my second day back, they let me go in the middle of the day, and I was like, "What is going on?" And I think basically Bruce had felt, well, it's in the book, and he has a different take on it, but I remember it quite vividly that he was kind of threatened by a couple of things. One was the fact that I was effectively running CZ out of Sub Pop, and I was, he felt like I was maybe conflicted, whereas actually I had a lot of integrity around that and a lot of awareness that could be seen as a conflict. So I would come in early and do CZ work, and then I would punch into the clock, so we had a time clock, and then I would do CZ work or Sub Pop work, or I would kind of do Sub Pop work, and then at like 4:00 I would punch out, and then I would spend a couple hours doing CZ stuff. So I was very clear about where those delineations were. But the other thing that happened, which I think maybe was a bigger part of it, was that Kiss covers compilation that I did.
Right.
Originally, the license came from Waterfront Records in Australia, and I was dealing with them a lot because we were moving a lot of their product through Sub Pop, through distribution. And they were putting this record out, and they were looking for a U.S. licensee. And they said, hey, do you think Sub Pop might be interested? And I said, I think that would be really cool. And I went to John and Bruce, and they're like, nah, we're not interested. And so I told them, I said, they're not interested. And they said, well, what about CZ? And I'm like, yeah, I'm interested. So their record was a 2-record set. I put it out as a 1-record set because I thought there was a lot of filler. And then I got a couple of bands. I was the one who actually got the Nirvana track that was on there, which is also on the Australian one. But for instance, I got a Melvins track for mine that I did not give to Waterfront in Australia. So I had a couple of tracks that were on the American CZ version only. And that record came out on the very, very same day that the first Afghan Wigs record came out. And I was a huge Afghan Wigs fan. Yeah. I still am. I think they're a great band.
I love them.
But I don't know if you remember the album cover of that very first record. It's called Up In It on Sub Pop.
There's a hand on it, I think.
A hand with a stitch on it. And I'm like, this is a terrible cover. It's totally nondescript. And it was a hard sell. It just didn't make people want to buy it. And so what was happening is initial sales on Afghan Wigs was shit. And I was pushing the hell out of it. But meanwhile, people were buying the Kiss covers comp hand over fist. And I think Bruce was convinced that I was basically upselling that and pushing it at the expense of Afghan Wigs. And I'm like, dude, I'm not pushing Kiss at all because I don't have to. And I'm pushing the hell out of Afghan Wigs because I really believe in this band. And I think those two things together, they're just like, well, we need somebody 110%. And I'm like, well, you got me 98%, But the good thing about that was actually that, I was really angry and really bitter for actually a number of years because I thought it was completely unwarranted. But that experience of being let go from Sub Pop was what pushed me into saying, all right, maybe it's time to try doing CZ as something more than just a hobby. Maybe I need to actually see if I can turn this into a full-on label and actually have it be, the source of my livelihood. And so I went for it. And at our peak, we had like a dozen employees, and we're a full-service indie record label. And for 8.5 years of my life, it's all I did, and it was how I made a living. Albeit a pretty feeble living. But I used to joke that bands that were on the label made more than their president, which was probably true. But I got to do that, and I got to put out a lot of great records by a lot of great bands. And I have no qualms about that being part of my history at all.
Now, a lot of this stuff is going to be in the book too.
Yeah. We'll see. It kind of, I don't know what all is going to be in the book until it's all in the book. I'm in the process now of doing a lot of editorial with the raw transcriptions, because they need a lot of work and whittling down and cleaning up, and so once I start kind of chunking pieces out from the different interviews and kind of putting them into a timeline, we'll see what narrative fully comes out. I don't know that little story I just told you. Yes, that will be in the book. Cool. But we'll see. It's going to be an interesting book.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, I think like these days it seems like a lot of books are coming out on stuff that's fairly obscure, and people seem to be, taking to it. I think it's like, kind of riding a wave of music related books these days.
I remain fascinated by how much interest there still is in the Seattle scene from back then, because it was so long ago. Although, to be fair, in my mind, it ended when Skinyard ended. No, it ended when I left Skinyard. I kind of forget that the Seattle grunge scene went for a number of years past 1991. But, it is still fascinating to me. All these bands and all this history that's like, literally 25 years old still has a really, really rabid and loyal following. Like a lot of the Skinyard fans are these pretty young kids. They're in their 20s. And I'm just shocked at how much they all know. Like, they're sponges. They absorb all of it. And they're into all of these bands. And I think it's great. I think it's amazing. I don't know if that's because so much of that music is, in fact, that good, that it just has the staying power, or if it's the legend of all of it, or maybe it's both. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I imagine it's both too, and also, I mean, the bands that came out of that era too, I mean, are mainstays, in our culture. So it makes sense that people would look back on that period and that particular region for, with reverence, and also the periphery is also more in focus than in some other places.
And most of it to me doesn't really sound dated anymore. Or I shouldn't say anymore. Most of that material doesn't sound dated 25, 30 years later, which I find interesting. Like, to me, Soundgarden still sounds as fresh now as it did then, Green River doesn't sound particularly dated, Nirvana, I've heard so much that I kind of don't need to hear Nirvana anymore, but I can still listen to it objectively and go, this is really good shit. Whereas if you listen to a lot of the metal that, say, came out in the 80s, kind of before all that, a lot of that sounds really, really dated. Even if it's still good, it still sounds dated.
Yeah, definitely. It's a nostalgia thing almost that people listen to as a result of that.
Yeah. Like, I was listening this morning to Judas Priest Breaking the Law, because apparently today, April 14th, I guess, is the 40-year anniversary of when that record came out.
Yeah, I think I saw something about that online. Yeah.
I'm kind of listening to it going, yeah, it's a great song. Wow, it really sounds dated though, doesn't it? And a lot of those bands back then, they reach that point where suddenly they sound very much of their time. And I feel like a lot of the bands from that whole Seattle scene still kind of managed to remain sounding timeless. And I'm not sure if it's something in the water or what, Even the U-Men still have this kind of timeless quality to it, to me.
Well, thanks, Daniel. I appreciate it. And we're all looking forward to this book, man, and definitely stay in touch with when that's going to be released. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Metal Matters, a Gimme Radio weekly podcast. Tune in next week and see what we have in store for you. The show is available on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, etc. Also, be sure to check out Gimme Radio, streaming on the web, iOS, or Android, for one of the best metal communities, exclusive merch, interviews with artists, and so much more. I'll catch you guys next week. Take care.